Here we are at Rough Trade Records, Rough Trade East in Brick Lane, East London, the home of rock and pop culture. What better place than here to celebrate 50 odd years of music culture? Over there I just saw an amazing Neil Young record, Harvest, one of my all-time favourites. Down here I just saw Amy Winehouse, Back to Black, another masterpiece. There could be nowhere better, and we're here to talk about rock legends. There is something about Canadian rock music that has its own character. Here you have this enormous country with only 20 million people, bordering America, the home of rock and roll. And yet, if you listen to Neil Young, the band, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, all the way up to the Arcade Fire, there's something about it which is different. It's got its own sort of energy, which is distinct from the USA.
Canadian rock is very, very difficult to define. There isn't a sound that is Canadian rock, but what there is many strands of rockers who are Canadian. And these Canadians have developed and enhanced genres that have existed before. They've taken music on a step further. And I think that is what unifies Canadian rockers. They make things better.
For a country with such a small population, Canada has really given the world some incredible musicians and artists. And I think what kind of links them and makes them unique is their individuality, their sense of really knowing who they are and what they're doing, not following trends, but doing something very unique and new. And also like a great musicality. There's a lot of talent there, and that's just kind of bursting out of that country.
Of course, the greatest of all Canadian rockers is Neil Young. Born in 1945 in Toronto, his father, Scott, was a sports writer, journalist. His mother was a daughter of the American Revolution, grew up in middle-class comfort, had very bad polio as a child, discovered Bob Dylan very early on, discovered Elvis Presley early on, knew what he wanted to do, formed bands in high school like the Jades, and was very quickly performing in the folk clubs of Toronto, finding his own sound. There's an early song by Neil Young called Sugar Mountain, which is all about the sadness of leaving childhood behind and feeling that there's nothing left and you've lost your innocence. He was only 19 when he wrote it. It's remarkable. So Neil Young was filtering the American experience, really, of the great songwriters like Bob Dylan through his own prism and coming up with something as good, very, very much different and brilliantly poetic, very, very thoughtful. And he could go from rock to singer-songwriter folk in a very, very natural fashion and always sounds like Neil Young. You always know the moment you hear Neil Young that it's him.
Neil Young was very influenced by Bob Dylan, in particular his lyrical style. For a short while, Neil Young played in a band called the Minor Birds with Rick James. But that band, although they'd had a record contract, had to disband when Rick James was arrested for going AWOL from the American Army. And it was at this point that Neil Young decided to sell all the band's equipment and use the money to buy a car and travel to LA.
1965, 1966, Neil Young had been building a name for himself on the Toronto folk club circuit, just playing little venues. And he'd met Joni Mitchell, he'd been influenced by Bob Dylan, but also the great Scottish guitarist Bert Jansch, developing his own style along the way. But he knew that if he wanted to make it, he had to go to America. He famously drove a hearse down to Los Angeles, and he was stuck in traffic on Sunset Strip when he saw Stephen Stills, who he knew from the folk club circuit already. He had met him in Canada. And they got chatting and decided to form a band, and that became Buffalo Springfield, which was one of the great folk rock bands. Got songs like For What It's Worth, Mr. Soul. It was along the same time as the Byrds, also the Beatles, obviously. And it was a brilliant band, but short-lived. partly because Neil Young knew that he wanted to be a solo artist and he wasn't going to stay with the Buffalo Springfield. So he quickly got his own backing band, who are called Crazy Horse, and they were perfect for him because although quite straightforward, rudimentary players, they were very, very, very good at interpreting his music and keeping the rawness, which is always at the heart of what Neil Young does. It's never too fussy, never too flashy, but there's a lot of talent in there and a lot of precision, which is masked by an apparent casual quality to it. So if you hear his second solo album, Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, which is made with Crazy Horse, it's a great rock album and it's got this Canadian quality, it's got this outdoorsy sort of ruggedness to it, but the songs are very, very clever. Neil Young. What is it about this guy? I really love him. I don't know why. I've interviewed him a bunch of times. He was not particularly easy, but something about him, he's such an original. And I've always wondered if he's taking his Canadian culture and looking at the culture of the United States through his own lens. I sometimes wonder if Canadian rockers do that. You have Bryan Adams, who's almost trying to be a kind of Bruce Springsteen of Canada. The Arcade Fire, the ultimate sort of indie band, I guess, anthemic indie band. They've all got something which is slightly different from the United States. It definitely has its own character, but it has this massive border just across right there. You feel that there's all of this influence from the USA and they take it their own way. And Neil Young, I think, exemplifies that better than anyone.
And a voice calls out the numbers, and it sometimes mentions mine. And I feel, Lord, I feel like I've been working overtime.
Joni Mitchell grew up in a small town in Saskatchewan, and as a child she contracted polio, and one of the results of that was a weakened left hand, and this meant that when she turned to the guitar, that her tunings were very, very different because she didn't have the strength to tune her guitar properly. And these new specialised tunings made Joni Mitchell different from the very, very beginning of her career when she played the Canadian coffee house circuit.
Joni Mitchell is not a rocker by any stretch of the imagination, but she is Canadian and she was great friends with Neil Young. He wrote Sugar Mountain. She did, in response, a song called The Circle Game, saying that life doesn't finish at childhood, there's plenty more, life goes round and round. And she was good friends with David Crosby, who saw her performing in Florida in a little club and brought her over to the Laurel Canyon scene, where everyone was amazed by the quality of her songwriting. She then met and fell in love with Graham Nash. They had a long relationship together, wrote songs about each other. And her break really came after performing in little coffee shops in Calgary in Canada. She got a break from her fantastic song, actually. I mean, again, very, very wise song, Both Sides Now. That became a hit. And that really got Joni Mitchell's career going. And so very quickly, she became known for this very thoughtful, very poetic songwriting, which she compounded with incredible guitar playing.
The album Blue was released in June 1971 and it was a huge critical and commercial success. It's very confessional, it's very intimate, and it actually started a trend really for that kind of songwriting, especially in popular music, really laying yourself bare in your songs in a much more open way than had previously happened. And Blue now is held up as one of, the defining singer-songwriter albums of the 1970s.
Over time, I lost my fire now. Over time, always playing one more hand for one more.
You need a man that'll treat you like the woman you are. Those little boys are just fooling around with your heart.
Bryan Adams was born on November the 5th, 1959 in Kingston, Ontario. Both parents were British. His father was a diplomat, and he discovered rock and roll very early on when he was about 10. And he wanted to get a Les Paul because he had seen Steve Marriott of Humble Pie play one. So he learned how to play guitar. He started writing songs in high school, and he met a guy called Jim Vallance, who was in a Canadian rock band called Prism. Jim Vallance was very important because he saw this talent that Bryan Adams had. But at that point, Bryan Adams hadn't really worked out how to write songs. Jim Vallance was writing songs all the time, so they started co-writing, and that launched his career. He didn't hit it off immediately. The first 2 albums did okay, didn't do that much. But by the 3rd album, everything changed. He met a producer called Bob Clearmountain, who'd worked with the Rolling Stones, worked with all kinds of greats. And Bob Clearmountain heard what Bryan Adams could be. It could be kind of Bruce Springsteen of Canada, doing heartland rock. And he encouraged him to do songs like Kids Wanna Rock, and probably his best song, which is Summer of '69, which is really about, should I go the same way as my friends and get normal jobs and marry and everything, or should I pursue this dream, which seems so incredibly unlikely to be successful, which is being a rock star? Of course, we know how that ended.
Bryan Adams was working with Bob Clearmountain, who was an esteemed producer, who'd worked with the Rolling Stones, he'd worked with Bruce Springsteen. And Bob Clearmountain understood how to make reasonably simple but very, very attractive rockers and to get them on the radio. And this would prove to be the career-making moment of Bryan Adams' career, with the album Cuts Like a Knife, his 3rd album, and the single Straight From the Heart, which was one of the few songs not co-written with Jim Vallance. And this became Bryan Adams' breakthrough, and it established him as a purveyor of straightforward blue-collar rock. And this, of course, appealed to a lot of people in Canada. He was initially successful in Canada before his radio-friendly music and his brilliant live shows took him to America.
Bryan Adams is, not just one of the biggest rock stars in Canada, he's one of the biggest rock stars in the world. He's known for this rasping voice, for his great power ballads and rock hits. And, during the 90s, he was the king of the soundtracks as well.
Rush are a progressive Canadian rock band made up of Geddy Lee on bass, Alex Lifeson on guitar, and Neil Peart on drums. Formed in 1968, inspired by Cream and Led Zeppelin, and was taking that influence and doing it their own way. And Rush made an album called 2112, which was a dystopian sci-fi epic inspired by the writings of Ayn Rand. So they were very, very ambitious from early on. Rush wanted to take on board things that go beyond the normal rock and roll culture. They wanted to take on these ideas of dystopianism, society, where it's going, where the future was going. And that all poured into this music, which is very, very complex, very technically accomplished, and very, very successful. Rush sold albums in millions and millions.
Rush initially began as a covers band, playing the Toronto club scene. They'd cover Led Zeppelin songs, and there was absolutely nothing to distinguish them from the herd, apart from their very gifted musicianship. And they had a couple of albums which weren't particularly successful. But the breakthrough came with 2112. And this was the beginnings of the new Rush, where the music was incredibly complicated. Neil Peart's lyrics were very, very intellectual.
Rush made the progressive classics A Farewell to Kings and Rockfield, which is deep in the Welsh countryside, which must have been an unusual experience for these 3 Canadians, but also a great experience because it was so isolated. And I think what Rush were trying to do was almost do a sort of the equivalent of a science fiction novel or movie blockbuster in musical form. Their albums were always concepts, always progressive, always had a lot of different elements moving together to create this kind of vast whole. And so I think they locked themselves away in Rockfield, in the, surrounded by fields and sheep and so on, and made progressive rock epics.
I think there is an argument that Rush are possibly the greatest Canadian band. They're a band who took from all sorts of genres. There was hints of reggae, there was bits of funkiness in some of their work alongside the prog stuff. And they took from all these genres, and for the most part, they bettered them. And I think Rush is really a tribute to imagination and adventure.
The Arcade Fire are an art rock band from Montreal in Quebec, led by husband and wife Win Butler and Regine Chassagne. Joined by Richard Reed Parry a year later. They formed in high school in 2001, and their first album, Funeral, was inspired by a series of bereavements that they had gone through. And one of the things that really marked it out was that the Arcade Fire were an indie band. They were coming from the alternative world, the literary world, taking inspiration from poetry, paintings, literature, not mainstream pop. But they had an anthemic quality, a sort of earnestness almost, which lent itself to stadium rock. So very, very quickly, they became an extremely successful band.
Arcade Fire formed in 2001 in Montreal, and they were initially an indie band, but they saw the bigger picture. They were an indie band who aspired to stadium rock. They had the desperate yearning for sales. They saw the big picture, and they think that we could make the biggest music that's ever been made. And there was something, I think, specifically Canadian about an idea which at first glance sounds ludicrous, that we're a college band, but they weren't earnest, they weren't small. They had these incendiary live shows where this music, which was always suitable for arenas and stadia, rocked the little clubs of Montreal. And very, very soon, people began to take notice of them. It was a quick rise for Arcade Fire.
Arcade Fire are one of those bands who really embrace pushing boundaries as a performance band. When you see them play, quite often members will swap instruments and they'll do very avant-garde and arty things and things you've never seen before. So for example, I watched them play in what was essentially a boxing ring in the middle, in the round at Wembley Arena. Another time I saw them on a tour where they encouraged all the audience to turn up wearing Venetian-style masks. So, they really bring this performance art element to their music.
Canada is only a country of 20 million people, but it's a huge space. And the interesting thing when you look at Canadian rock is how many huge talents emerged from quite a small population. From Neil Young to Joni Mitchell to Bryan Adams to the Arcade Fire. These are all massive names who really got to the top of their game, whatever field they'd chosen to go into. You sometimes wonder if they had the inspiration from having this very long border next to America and feeling that they had to up the game. They had to do better, otherwise they couldn't just copy America. They had to do something which took on American rock music and raise the stakes. They had to take it, imprint themselves onto it and go somewhere new.